Hi, I'm Gordon from Camera Labs, and this is my hands-on first looks video all about the EOS R1, the official flagship camera in Canon's mirrorless series. A specialist model aimed primarily at pro sports photographers, it features a 24.2 megapixel stacked sensor, 40 frames per second electronic bursts with pre-capture options, an impressive viewfinder with eye control, 6K video, and their most advanced autofocus to date, all packed into a tough body with a built-in portrait grip. Launched in July 2024, it comes 4 years after the 1DX Mark III, the previous model in the prestigious 1 series. It costs around $6,300 or £7,000, but check the links in the description for the latest pricing, or even to order if you're already sold. Canon brought me to the European press event in Munich, Germany, where I got to try out the R1 and the R5 Mark II that was launched alongside it, and I've got a separate video dedicated to the R5 II if you're interested in that camera. In this video, I'll be showing you what's new, what features are shared between the two bodies, as there's actually quite a lot in common, along with some results from these pre-production cameras. I'll follow up with my full in-depth reviews once final production models are available, and I'll link to them here when they're ready. So while this video is a first looks report, I've still got loads to show you, so let's get on with it. Looking back at recent 1 series launches, Canon's kept to a roughly 4-year cycle, in turn coinciding with the Summer Olympics. As such, it's no surprise for the R1 to be launched in mid-24, but given the 3-year-old EOS R3 was already so capable, I personally wondered where Canon could go with its flagship model. Most obviously, many of us assumed that it would debut Canon's first sensor with a global shutter, especially since they've been teasing developments and because arch rival Sony has already played its hand with the A9 III. But the R1 has arrived with a stacked sensor instead, admittedly faster than the R3s but still lacking global readout. Canon explained that they can achieve better image quality right now with their stacked sensor, coupled with a new low-pass filter to maximize the detail, while the improved readout speed is sufficiently fast to minimize skewing from rolling shutter, at least that's what they say. As for the resolution, Canon's been pitching the 1 series at around 18 to 24 megapixels for many generations now, so clearly believes this is the right amount for pro sports. If you want more, just go for the R5 II launched alongside it, which again shares many of the same features. Of course, any company will claim that their current solution delivers the best results, but you do wonder if the R1 was originally slated to include global, and that it simply wasn't ready in time for the Paris Olympics, or even if it turned out to be an inappropriate technology for their flagship sports camera. Interestingly, there was a global sensor upgrade option for the C700 cinema camera, but that model's designed for video alone, and the upgrade lacks autofocus, so it isn't suitable for a camera aimed at high-speed sports photography. Analysing results from the R1 will of course show where it stands against the competition, but the lack of a new sensor type does leave the R1 without an obvious headline feature to shout about. Indeed, at first glance, it appears to share so much with the R3 that Canon's presentation included a slide listing 100 differences and improvements. Some of these are certainly bigger than others, but the R1 is definitely more about the sum of these parts rather than a handful of hero upgrades. Right, let's get into the design, which again at first glance looks a lot like the existing EOS R3, albeit with a different textured finish. The R1 is a tad larger, 8mm taller and 7mm wider than the R3, not to mention 100 grams heavier, but unless you have them side by side, you're unlikely to notice much difference once they're in your hands. While the R1 does become closer to the 1DX Mark III in overall heft, that DSLR remains noticeably taller and 135 grams heavier, so there are some mild savings with the mirrorless version. Like the R3 and the 1DX Mark III, the R1's build quality is excellent, feeling almost bulletproof and able to take on whatever you throw at it. I know that Sony, for example, prefers to let you decide whether to fit an optional grip or not, but having it built in here just gives these bodies an undeniable air of confidence, solidity and robustness, and I personally love how they look and feel. Suffice it to say, the R1 is fully weather sealed, and while there don't appear to be any obvious vents that I could see, I didn't experience any overheating in my tests so far. Like the R3, the sheer heft of the camera and the chance to better separate the components, battery and slots improves heat dissipation. From the top, the R1 looks almost identical to the R3, starting with 2 buttons to adjust the drive and AF modes, bracketing, flash compensation and metering. In the middle is one of Canon's multifunction shoes, first seen on the EOS R3, but now sporting a new cover with a clip to hold it in place. The fastest flash sync is 3/20th of a second with the EFC shutter, or 400th with the fully electronic, Not bad, although way below the A9 III. Meanwhile, the upper right side is dominated by a square information screen, alongside a button that reverses the text and background colour. As before, there's a mode button inside the thumb dial, along with an exposure compensation button, but new to the R1 is one for white balance too. Meanwhile, towards the front of the grip are a finger dial, the M function button for adjusting the AF area, and the soft touch shutter release. These, along with the joystick, smart controller and some corner buttons, are all duplicated when holding the camera by the portrait grip. Speaking of which, look below the body and you'll see that Canon's also included a strap lug that lets you carry the camera in the portrait orientation, a feature inherited from the 1DX Mark III that was sadly lacking on the R3. Oh, and as teased, the R1 and R5 Mark II become Canon's first bodies that can use the aperture ring on hybrid Z lenses for photos as well as video. I believe this will also come to future bodies, but I'm unsure about older ones and I wouldn't hold your breath. Turning to the rear, the control layout again looks much the same as the R3, including a collar to switch between movies and stills with a record button in the middle. There's also the choice of a joystick or smart controller, the traditional large flat thumb wheel, and a clicky power switch with a lock position. New to the R1 over the R3 are a duplicate info button for portrait shooting and an extra button under the screen, allowing rate in the top left corner to be reassigned as a spare function button. Like the 1DX Mark III, some of the rear buttons can also be backlit for easier visibility in low light. If you're not familiar with the R3 or 1DX3, you'll be wondering what exactly is the smart controller alongside the joystick. Well, this works as a standard AF on button, but also provides an alternative way to move the AF area or push around an enlarged image in playback. It employs optical technology, kind of like an upside down computer mouse, and I quite enjoy how it feels under your thumb. But the R1 extends its functionality by supporting a half press action, which you can configure separately to a full push from the menus if desired. Dominating the rear of the camera though is the substantial housing for the viewfinder, which includes an improved version of Canon's eye control technology that was first seen on the EOS R3. But first the EVF itself, which becomes Canon's first to employ a 9.44 million dot panel coupled with a generous 0.9 times magnification. This is not only larger and more detailed than the R3, but brighter too, making it by far Canon's best quality electronic viewfinder to date. There's also an option for blackout-free shooting, albeit I believe with a tiny delay. The large housing not only provides a comfortable shade and anti-fog features, but also accommodates the infrared LEDs and sensors that are used for eye control. These can track the position of your actual eye and know where you're looking. Like the R3, the idea is not to position an actual AF area by eye control alone, but to select between subjects that have already been recognised by the AF system by simply glancing at them. This worked really well for me on the R3, and now on the R1 and R5 Mark II, Canon has improved the accuracy. You can also refine the system by repeating the calibration process, and you can store results for multiple people if desired. I found it surprisingly effective at quickly selecting a target for the AF system to subsequently track, which makes it ideal whether you're photographing sports teams, groups of birds or animals, or even people at a wedding or an event, or even in a street photography scenario. It may not work in video, but remains a valuable and unique feature in the Canon system, and as I'll show you in a moment, further autofocus advances make it even easier to drill down to the desired target. Moving on to the screen, the R1 employs a 3.2-inch panel with 2.1 million dots, that's side-hinged, allowing it to flip out and twist at any angle, including forward to face you or back on itself for protection. Since the 1DX Mark III had a fixed screen, I wondered if Canon would follow suit with the R1, but they clearly believe the mechanism that was used on the R3 is sufficiently robust for the R1, although strangely the panel itself is less detailed than the 4.15 million dots of the R3. Like the R3, the R1 is powered by the same LP E19 pack, rated for 1330 shots with the screen or 700 with the viewfinder under super conditions, more than quoted for the R3, although in practice you'll probably achieve a lot more on either camera, especially if you're firing off electronic bursts. Behind a door on the grip side you'll find twin CF Express Type B card slots, the same as the 1DX Mark III, but a key difference over the R3 and R5 too, which only have one CF Express and one SD slot. Behind a series of rubber flaps on the left side are 3.5mm microphone and headphone jacks, flash sync, USB-C and full-size HDMI ports, and an Ethernet port that now supports faster 2.5 gigabit speeds. It's great that Canon's finally got the message about unwanted micro HDMI ports, and you can also use the R1s to output ProRes RAW video. Meanwhile, the USB-C port supports version 3.2 and can work as a webcam, although sadly there's no option to connect a USB SSD drive. I am pleased to report the R1 inherits the built-in GPS receiver of the R3, allowing you to tag images with location data and local time without any additional accessories. You can see the embedded data here. Canon has also upgraded the Wi-Fi to support 6E, allowing it to connect to less congested 6 GHz networks. Moving on, as you already know, the EOS R1 employs a back-illuminated stacked CMOS sensor with 24.2 megapixels, but Canon stressed this was different from the sensor in the EOS R3. For starters, it's faster than the R3, with Canon claiming the rolling shutter on the R1's electronic sensor is in fact now faster than the mechanical shutter on the 1DX Mark III. Here's a quick panning test with the electronic shutter at 40 frames per second, where there's no visible skewing on the vertical lines, or at least none that I'm personally worried about just yet. Now, I will be doing more tests in my final review, as well as comparing it against rivals, but so far it's looking good. Secondly, the R1 sensor may share the same 24 megapixel resolution as the R3, but it is coupled with a new low-pass filter that claims to reduce color and brightness moire, while also improving the resolve detail. The R1 can also boost the resolution, but not with a pixel shift mode as you might expect. In fact, while the camera does of course have IBIS, which can move the sensor with up to 8.5 stops of compensation under super conditions, there's actually no pixel shift option on either the R1 or R5 II. Instead, for both cameras, Canon's opted to implement AI upscaling in playback on any JPEG or HIF file that you've captured. This doubles the pixel count in each axis, generating a file with 96 megapixels in camera on the R1. It takes about 5 seconds to process a JPEG in my tests. Now, Canon's opted to exclude in-camera upscaling of RAW files as it says they'd take too long, but I believe this will be offered in an upcoming plugin for Lightroom. So let's have a look at some examples which I took with pre-production R1, first zooming in on the original 24 megapixel file before comparing it to the upscaled version generated in camera on the right. As you can see, the upscaling is delivering what looks like an intelligently sharpened image with the appearance of more detail in certain areas. I believe the process may actually be recognizing specific elements and enhancing them differently to others, and when looking closely at my samples with varying effectiveness. Ultimately, your mileage will vary depending on the subject, but importantly, none of this is baked into a pixel shift file, nor subject to the motion issues that plagues that particular process. You just take your photos as normal, then choose whether to generate an enhanced version in playback later. You've still got the original if you want to use that. Now, the benefit of Canon upscaling in camera versus third-party software on a computer later is having knowledge of the entire capture pipeline from the lens and the camera type to the image processing that's already been applied, and in theory could be reversed. You can also select multiple images in playback to process in bulk. Going forward, I'm interested to see how enhancing RAW files might avoid having to deal with pre-compressed JPEG and HIF files, although Canon did assure me that the process is aware of how an image is compressed and can effectively reverse it. Canon's also been talking about noise reduction with neural networks for some time now, and this too has made it into the R1's playback menus, but this time as part of the RAW post-processing. So when you select a RAW file for processing during playback, you'll not only see the usual options, but under the NR section, a new setting to enable neural network noise reduction. As before, you select the options you desire before saving the result as a new JPEG or HIF file, which of course can subsequently be AI upscaled in camera too if you like. To show you what it can do, here's a RAW plus JPEG that I took with the R1 at 12,800 ISO, so let's zoom into a portion for a closer look. I'll keep the original in-camera JPEG on the left before comparing it to the RAW version on the right, processed with neural network noise reduction set to the default middle value. At this sensitivity, there already wasn't much noise on the original file to start with, but the processed version on the right is visibly cleaner with better defined edges. In my test so far with the R5 II, the benefit became more apparent at higher sensitivities. Oh, and there's also a new blur detection feature which can tag images in playback to help you more quickly identify those which are sharp. Moving on to autofocus, the R1 enjoys a number of upgrades aided by a new Digic accelerator processor, and many of the new features are shared with the R5 II. I'll detail these in a moment, but first talk about one feature that's exclusive to the R1. It sports Canon's first imaging sensor with cross-type autofocus, improving accuracy on vertical detail. Now in Canon's dual pixel AF system, each colour filter in the traditional 2x2 Bayer array covers a pair of photodiodes, and that allows them to perform both focusing and imaging duties. Now under one of those 4 colour filters, actually the second of the 2 green filters, the pair of diodes on the R1 are twisted by 90 degrees, and that's what gives it the cross-type capability. As for what's shared with the R5 II, subject recognition now includes horses, aeroplanes and trains, while human recognition has received major enhancements. First, the system can now better identify poses and upper bodies, stay locked onto a subject as others pass in front of it, as well as recognising actual sporting movements. The new action priority mode has knowledge of 3 sports, soccer, basketball and volleyball, and attempts to anticipate the movement of the ball in those games to change the target AF area. In short, if it recognises one player passing to another, it should automatically switch to the recipient, or if it detects, say, a spike in volleyball or an approaching dunk in basketball, it'll again switch to that player. Now you may be wondering why these 3 sports in particular. Well, right now the technology is looking for the movement of one large circular ball as it moves between players, as opposed to smaller or non-circular balls that may be harder to see or perhaps held by a player. Other sports may be added in the future though. You can further refine the priority of specific people by registering their faces with the camera. You can preload a photo from any source or take one with the camera itself on site, and amazingly it only needs one shot face on to work its magic. I believe you can store 10 different people in a bank, and you can store up to 10 banks on a card, although only one bank is active in the camera at a time. Here I've registered myself with a single photo, after which you can see an additional icon alongside me in live view, and see how it stays recognised even as I turn to profile. Note that I've also restricted it to a central zoned area here, so it doesn't always pick me up. Now this system can not only be useful if you're concentrating on key players in a match, but equally beneficial at events or weddings where you can preload images of the most important people and give them priority over the others. I tried out the R1 for shooting basketball at the Canon event and found that action priority did a good job at anticipating the action most of the time when given the entire frame to analyse. I also found the R1's AF felt snappier and more engaged than the R5 II, presumably aided by those cross-type sensors. As with all AF systems, you'll improve your success if you can drill down. Traditionally that's with a smaller, more focused area, but here by exploiting registered people, or using the eye control to override and quickly select the desired target. Now I've only had a brief time with the R1 so far, but the autofocus system is definitely a highlight, as indeed it should be on a flagship sports camera. As for burst shooting, the R1's mechanical shutter offers the same 12 frames per second at up to 8,000th of a second as the R3, but the electronic shutter has accelerated to a top speed of 40 frames per second and a maximum shutter speed of 64,000th of a second. In a small but very useful upgrade, you can also select slower frame rates at more intervals, including 30, 20, 15, 12, 10, 7.5, 5, 3, 2 or 1 frames per second. Now I couldn't find the limited high-speed burst mode of the R3, but more importantly the R1 does now have a proper pre-burst option when shooting electronically. It works simply as you'd hope, buffering up to 20 shots as you half press the shutter, which works out at half a second's worth of action when set to the fastest 40 frames per second, or a full second if you're shooting at 20 frames per second. Now half a second doesn't sound like much, but it's actually plenty if you fully push the shutter down as soon as the key event takes place, whether that's a ball being kicked or a bird taking flight. Unlike the R5 II, which became quite warm during sustained bursts with pre-capture in my test though, the R1's temperature seemed to remain pretty constant throughout my tests. Again, the larger body provides room to separate the hot components inside and better manage the heat. In some of my bursts though, you may notice my pre-production R1 exhibiting some banding when shooting directly into very bright artificial lights. I also noticed this with the R5 II under the same conditions. Now I'm not yet sure if the electronic shutter was to blame, and I should note it didn't affect my video clips. Ultimately, much more testing is required under a variety of conditions. Moving on to video, the R1 builds upon its predecessor's capabilities with a number of options that better match the cinema camera series. These include renaming MP4 to XFAVCS or XFHEVCS, storing them in a new folder, and adding the option of C-Log2 as well as 3 in a new custom picture settings menu. The R1 may miss out on the waveform monitor of the R5 II, but does support 4-channel audio and has a tally lamp by the logo. You can film 1080 up to 240p or 4K up to 120p in either traditional 16:9 UHD or wider DCI formats, but there's still no open gate option. A 4K fine mode oversamples from 6K data up to 60p, while 6K DCI itself is available also up to 60p in Canon's CRM RAW format or output over HDMI as ProRes RAW. Pre-capture for video is available with a 3 or 5 second buffer, and there's also a new mode that lets you shoot stills as you record video, albeit limited to 1080 quality video with 17 megapixel stills in the 16:9 shape. In my test so far, the stack sensor definitely reduces the effect of skewing, but it may still be beaten by rivals. Meanwhile, graphite sheets for the sensor and card slot work with an aluminium alloy plate to dissipate heat, and Canon reckons you should get at least 2 hours worth of recording in most formats up to 60p. Rest assured, I will be doing plenty of overheating tests in my final review, but if it reassures you in the meantime, the R3 was only limited by memory or power in my own long recording tests. And that's all I can say for now until I spend more time with the final production model. Initially, I was disappointed there was no killer headline feature on the R1, but in my time with it so far, I still found it an extremely capable camera nonetheless. I personally think its biggest problem is the R3 was already so good, it arguably deserved the 1 badge 3 years ago. That in turn would have made this new camera spec more comfortable being pitched as a Mark II version rather than becoming the very first mirrorless 1 camera. Then there's the global shutter question, but what you really need to be asking yourself is whether you actually need it. Based on my A9 III test, they certainly have unique benefits over conventional sensors, not just in eliminating skewing, but also avoiding issues with banding, while also allowing very fast flash sync speeds. On the downside though, they do seem to come at the cost of reduced dynamic range, increased noise, and of course the high price of the sensor itself. So while it is interesting to speculate whether Canon originally intended for the R1 to have a global sensor and perhaps didn't achieve the quality it desired in time, the bottom line is to ask whether the R1 as it stands will give you the results you desire regardless, or if the alternative technology in the A9 III, or indeed a Nikon Z9 or an older R3 would be more appropriate for your actual needs. Check back later for my final review, but if you're already sold on the R1 or it's cemented an alternative decision for you, please do consider ordering through my links below. I also have a separate video all about the R5 II if that's more your cup of tea. Do let me know what you think in the comments, particularly if you photograph sports professionally. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.